Capital, Volume 1. This independent recording by Andrew S. Reitenberg is public domain, both in content and in audio. Chapter 28. Bloody legislation against the expropriated since the end of the 15th century. The forcing down of wages by Act of Parliament. The proletariat, created by the breaking up of the bands of feudal retainers and by the forcible expropriation of the people from the soil, this free and rightless proletariat could not possibly be absorbed by the nascent manufactures as fast as it was thrown upon the world. On the other hand, these men, suddenly dragged from their accustomed mode of life, could not immediately adapt themselves to the discipline of their new condition. They were turned in massive quantities into beggars, robbers, and vagabonds, partly from inclination, in most cases under the force of circumstances. Hence, at the end of the 15th and during the whole of the 16th centuries, a bloody legislation against vagabondage was enforced throughout Western Europe. The fathers of the present working class were chastised for their enforced transformation into vagabonds and paupers. Legislation treated them as voluntary criminals and assumed that it was entirely within their powers to go on working under the old conditions which, in fact, no longer existed. In England, this legislation began under Henry VII. Henry VIII, 1530. Beggars who are old and incapable of working receive a beggar's license. On the other hand, whipping and imprisonment for sturdy vagabonds. They are to be tied to the cart tail and whipped until the blood streams from their bodies. Then they are to swear on oath to go back to their birthplace or to where they have lived for the last 3 years and to put themselves to labor. What grim irony! By 27 Henry VIII, c. 25, the previous statute is repeated, but strengthened with new clauses. For the second arrest for vagabondage, the whipping is to be repeated and half the ear sliced off, but for the third relapse, the offender is to be executed as a hardened criminal and enemy of the commonweal. Edward VI, a statute of the first year of his reign, 1547, ordains that if anyone refuses to work, he shall be condemned as a slave to the person who has denounced him as an idler. The master shall feed his slave on bread and water, weak broth, and such refuse meat as he thinks fit. He has the right to force him to do any work, no matter how disgusting, with whip and chains. If the slave is absent for a fortnight, he is condemned to slavery for life, and is to be branded on the forehead or back with the letter S. If he runs away 3 times, he is to be executed as a felon. The master can sell him, bequeath him, let him out on hire as a slave, just as he can any other personal chattel or cattle. If the slaves attempt anything against the masters, they are also to be executed. Justices of the peace, on information, are to hunt the rascals down. If it happens that a vagabond has been idling for about 3 days, he is to be taken to his birthplace, branded with a red-hot iron with the letter V on the breast, and set to work in chains on the roads or at some other labor. If the vagabond gives a false birthplace, he is then to become slave for life of that place, of its inhabitants, or its corporation, and to be branded with an S. All persons have the right to take away the children of the vagabonds and keep them as apprentices, the young men until they're 24, the girls until they're 20. If they run away, they are to become, until they reach these ages, the slaves of their masters, who can put them in irons, whip them, etc., if they like. Every master may put an iron ring around the neck, arms, or legs of his slave, by which to know him more easily and to be more certain of him. The last part of this statute provides that certain poor people may be employed by a place or by persons who are willing to give them food and drink and to find them work. Slaves of the parish of this kind were still to be found in England in the mid-19th century under the name of roundsmen. Elizabeth, 1572. Unlicensed beggars above 14 years of age are to be severely flogged and branded on the left ear unless someone will take them into service for 2 years. In case of a repetition of the offense, if they are over 18, they are to be executed, unless someone will take them into service for 2 years, but for the third offense they are to be executed without mercy as felons. Similar statutes, 18 Elizabeth c. 13, and another of 1597. James I. Anyone wandering about and begging is declared a rogue and a vagabond. Justices of the peace and petty sessions are authorized to have them publicly whipped and to imprison them for 6 months for the first offense and 2 years for the second. While in prison, they are to be whipped as much and as often as the justices of the peace think fit. Incorrigible and dangerous rogues are to be branded with an R on the left shoulder and set to hard labor, and if they are caught begging again, to be executed without mercy. These statutes were legally binding until the beginning of the 18th century. They were only repealed by 12 Anne c. 23. There were similar laws in France, where by the middle of the 17th century, a kingdom of vagabonds had been established in Paris. Even at the beginning of the reign of Louis XVI, the ordinance of the 13th of July, 1777, provided that every man in good health from 16 to 60 years of age, if without means of subsistence and not practicing a trade, should be sent to the galleys. The statute of Charles V for the Netherlands, October of 1537, the first edict of the states and towns of Holland, 10th of March, 1614, and the plaquat of the United Provinces, 26th of June, 1649, are further examples of the same kind. Thus were the agricultural folk first forcibly expropriated from the soil, driven from their homes, turned into vagabonds, and then whipped, branded, and tortured by grotesquely terroristic laws into accepting the discipline necessary for the system of wage labor. It is not enough that the conditions of labor are concentrated at one pole of society in the shape of capital, while at the other pole are grouped masses of men who have nothing to sell but their labor power. Nor is it enough that they are compelled to sell themselves voluntarily. The advance of capitalist production develops a working class which by education, tradition, and habit looks upon the requirements of that mode of production as self-evident natural laws. The organization of the capitalist process of production, once it is fully developed, breaks down all resistance. The constant generation of a relative surplus population keeps the law of supply and demand of labor, and therefore wages, within narrow limits which correspond to capital's valorization requirements. The silent compulsion of economic relations sets the seal on the domination of the capitalist over the worker. Direct extra-economic force is still of course used, but only in exceptional cases. In the ordinary run of things, the worker can be left to the natural laws of production, i.e., it is possible to rely on his dependence on capital, which springs from the conditions of production themselves and is guaranteed in perpetuity by them. It is otherwise during the historical genesis of capitalist production. The rising bourgeoisie needs the power of the state and uses it to regulate wages, i.e., to force them into the limits suitable for making a profit, to lengthen the working day, and to keep the worker himself at his normal level of dependence. This is an essential aspect of so-called primitive accumulation. The class of wage laborers, which arose in the latter half of the 14th century, formed then and in the following century only a very small part of the population, well protected in its position by the independent peasant proprietors in the countryside and by the organization of the guilds in the towns. Masters and artisans were not separated by any great social distance either on the land or in the towns. The subordination of labor to capital was only formal, i.e., the mode of production itself had as yet no specifically capitalist character. The variable element in capital preponderated greatly over the constant element. The demand for wage labor, therefore, grew rapidly with every accumulation of capital, while the supply only followed slowly behind. A large part of the national product, which was later transformed into a fund for the accumulation of capital, still entered at that time into the consumption fund of the workers. Legislation on wage labor, which aimed from the first at exploitation of the worker and, as it progressed, remained equally hostile to him, begins in England with the Statute of Laborers issued by Edward III in 1349. The Ordinance of 1350 in France, issued in the name of King John, corresponds to it. The English and French laws run parallel and are identical in content. Where these labor statutes aim at a compulsory extension of the working day, I shall not return to them, as we discussed this point earlier in Chapter 10, Section 5. The Statute of Laborers was passed at the urgent insistence of the House of Commons. A Tory says naively, "Formerly, the poor demanded such high wages as to threaten industry and wealth. Next, their wages are so low as to threaten industry and wealth equally and perhaps more, but in another way." A tariff of wages was fixed by law for town and country, for piecework and day work. The agricultural laborers were to hire themselves out by the year. The urban workers were to do so on the open market. It was forbidden, on pain of imprisonment, to pay higher wages than those fixed by the statute, but the taking of higher wages was more severely punished than the giving of them. Similarly, in sections 18 and 19 of Elizabeth's Statute of Apprentices, 10 days imprisonment is decreed for the person who pays the higher wages, but 21 days for the person who receives them. A statute of 1360 increased the penalties and authorized the masters to extort labor at the legal rate of wages by using corporal punishment. All combinations, contracts, oaths, etc., by which masons and carpenters reciprocally bound themselves were declared null and void. Workers' combinations are treated as heinous crimes from the 14th century until 1825, the year of the repeal of the laws against combinations. The spirit of the Statute of Laborers of 1349 and its offshoots shines out clearly in the fact that, while the state certainly dictates a maximum of wages, it on no account fixes a minimum. In the 16th century, as we know, the condition of the workers became much worse. The money wage rose, but not in proportion to the depreciation of money and the corresponding rise in the prices of commodities. Real wages therefore fell. Nevertheless, the laws for keeping them down remained in force, together with the ear-clipping and branding of those whom no one was willing to take into service. By 5 Elizabeth c. 3, the Statute of Apprentices, the justices of the peace were given the power to fix certain wages and to modify them according to the time of the year and the current prices of commodities. James I extended these labor regulations to weavers, spinners, and indeed to all other possible categories of worker. George II extended the laws against combinations of workers to all manufactures. In the period of manufacture properly so called, the capitalist mode of production had become sufficiently strong to render legal regulation of wages as impracticable as it was unnecessary, but the ruling classes were unwilling to be without the weapons of the old arsenal in case some emergency should arise. Hence, even in the 18th century, 7 George I c. 13 forbade a daily wage higher than 2 shillings 7 1/2 pence for journeymen tailors in and around London, except in cases of general mourning. 13 George III c. 68 handed over to the justices of the peace the task of regulating the wages of silk weavers. In 1796, it required 2 judgments of the higher courts to decide whether the orders made by justices of the peace as to wages also held good for non-agricultural workers, and in 1799, Parliament confirmed that the wages of mining workers in Scotland should continue to be regulated by a statute of Elizabeth and 2 Scottish Acts of 1661 and 1671. How completely the situation had been transformed in the meantime is proved by a hitherto unheard-of occurrence in the House of Commons. There, where for more than 400 years laws had been made for the maximum beyond which wages absolutely must not rise, Whitbread in 1796 proposed a legal minimum wage for agricultural laborers. Pitt opposed this, but conceded that the, quote, condition of the poor was cruel, end quote. Finally, in 1813, the laws for the regulation of wages were repealed. They became an absurd anomaly as soon as the capitalist began to regulate his factory by his own private legislation, and was able to make up the wage of the agricultural laborer to the indispensable minimum by means of the poor rate. The provisions of the statutes of laborers, as to contracts between master and workman, regarding giving notice and the like, which allow only a civil action against the master who breaks his contract, but permit, on the contrary, a criminal action against the worker who breaks his contract, are still in full force at this moment. The barbarous laws against combinations of workers collapsed in 1825 in the face of the threatening attitude of the proletariat. Despite this, they disappeared only in part. Certain pretty survivals of the old statutes did not vanish until 1859. Finally, the Act of the 29th of June, 1871, purported to remove the last traces of this class legislation by giving legal recognition to trade unions. But another act of the same date, titled An Act to Amend the Criminal Law Relating to Violence, Threats, and Molestation, in fact re-established the previous situation in a new form. This parliamentary conjuring trick withdrew the means the workers could use in a strike or lockout from the common law and placed them under exceptional penal legislation, the interpretation of which fell to the manufacturers themselves in their capacity of justices of the peace. 2 years earlier, the same House of Commons and the same Mr. Gladstone, in the customary honorable fashion, had brought in a bill for the removal of all exceptional penal legislation against the working class, but it was never allowed to go beyond the second reading, and the matter was drawn out in this way until at length the great Liberal party, by an alliance with the Tories, found the courage to turn decisively against the very proletariat that had carried it into power. Not content with this betrayal, the great Liberal party allowed the English judges, ever ready to wag their tails for the ruling classes, to exhume the earlier laws against conspiracy and apply them to combinations of workers. It is evident that only against its will, and under the pressure of the masses, did the English Parliament give up the laws against strikes and trade unions, after it had itself, with shameless egoism, held the position of a permanent trade union of the capitalists against the workers throughout 5 centuries. During the very first storms of the Revolution, the French bourgeoisie dared to take away from the workers the right of association they had just acquired. By a decree of the 14th of June, 1791, they declared that every combination by the workers was an assault on liberty and the declaration of the rights of man, punishable by a fine of 500 livres, together with the deprivation of the rights of an active citizen for 1 year. This law, which used state compulsion to confine the struggle between capital and labor within limits convenient for capital, has outlived revolutions and changes of dynasties. Even the Terror left it untouched. It was only struck out of the penal code quite recently. Nothing is more characteristic than the pretext for this bourgeois coup d'etat. Granting, says Le Chapelier, the rapporteur of the committee on this law, that wages ought to be a little higher than they are, that they ought to be high enough for him that receives them to be free from the state of absolute dependence which results from the lack of the necessaries of life, and which is almost a state of slavery. Granting this, the workers must nevertheless not be permitted to inform themselves about their own interests, nor to act in common and thereby lessen their absolute dependence, which is almost a state of slavery, because by doing this they infringe the liberty of their former masters, who are the present entrepreneurs, and because a combination against the despotism of the former masters of the corporations is, guess what? A restoration of the corporations abolished by the French Constitution.